It was just another evening. The kind of evening where the streets felt like they were moving at their own pace, indifferent to the world around them. The sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the city, and the hum of tires on asphalt created a steady rhythm that filled the air. Amara was driving home. The sleek, black car she drove wasn't the kind you often saw on these streets. It stood out, glossy, polished, the kind of car that drew eyes. Not because it was flashy, but because it spoke of success, of years of hard work, of achievements that most could only dream of. Her fingers rested lightly on the wheel, the leather seats cool against her skin, but her mind? It was elsewhere. The day had been long, filled with meetings and endless paperwork. All she wanted now was to get home, to escape into the quiet comfort of her apartment, where she could unwind, reflect, and leave the world behind for a little while. As she cruised down the street, the silence of her thoughts was interrupted by the sudden, harsh flash of blue and red lights behind her. Damn. She glanced in the rearview mirror. A police car. She sighed, pulling over to the side of the road, her heart beating just a little faster. It wasn't the first time she had been stopped. But the reason for this stop? That was a question she wasn't prepared for. She rolled down the window, the evening air now cool against her face. The officer, a man in his late 40s, stepped up to the window with a stern expression. His eyes briefly flicked over the car, and then settled on her. "Good evening, ma'am," he said, his tone clipped and businesslike. "Can I see your license and registration?" "Of course," Amara said, her voice calm, steady. She reached for her purse, not yet understanding why she was being pulled over. There hadn't been a reason, no speeding, no erratic driving. She wasn't doing anything wrong. The officer seemed to hesitate for a moment before speaking again. "Do you know why I stopped you, ma'am?" "No, I don't," Amara replied, her brows furrowing. The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, his eyes flicked back to the car, scanning it as though it was somehow out of place. And then, his words came out cold, almost as if they'd been rehearsed. "Your car. It looks too nice. Car like this on a street like this. I'm just making sure everything's in order." "Too nice?" The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Amara didn't know how to respond. Was this really happening? Was this officer stopping her simply because of the car she was driving? She took a deep breath, trying to keep the situation from escalating. "It's my car, officer. I worked hard to get it. I'm just going home." The officer's eyes hardened as he looked at her. "I need you to step out of the vehicle, ma'am. Put your hands on the hood." Amara's pulse quickened. "What?" For a moment, she didn't say anything. She just stared at him, her mind racing. There was something wrong with this, something that wasn't right, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it yet. The situation was already tense. The last thing she wanted was to make it worse. She opened the door and stepped out, her heels clicking on the pavement. She placed her hands on the hood of the car as the officer had requested, trying to steady her breath, trying to stay calm. But inside, a storm was brewing. Why was this happening to her? Why was the officer treating her like a criminal? The officer circled the car as he began to search, his eyes scanning every corner, every inch. Amara could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The bystanders on the sidewalk were starting to notice, some slowing down to watch, some whispering. The public spectacle had begun. And in that moment, she realized what was happening. This wasn't about traffic violations or a broken tail light. This was about the assumptions people made. The assumptions about her, about the car, about who she was, simply based on the exterior. The officer came back around to face her, and Amara could see the judgment in his eyes. "You're not carrying anything you shouldn't be, are you, ma'am?" he asked, his tone now sharp. Amara clenched her jaw. She had nothing to hide. But the implication, the suggestion that she could be guilty simply because of what she drove, was hard to ignore. "No, officer," she said, her voice steady. "I'm not carrying anything." The officer didn't respond. Instead, he gestured toward the car again. "All right, you can get back in your vehicle. I'll let you go with a warning," he said. But his tone still held a coldness. as if he had only just decided that she was safe enough to drive away. Amara slid back into her seat, her mind still racing. She started the engine, and the police car behind her flickered its lights one last time before turning off the road. She drove away slowly, the night swallowing the sounds of the city, but her heart still pounded in her chest. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just been humiliated, just been judged for something that had nothing to do with who she was. She had worked hard for everything she had, but none of that seemed to matter. To some people, all they saw was a woman of color in a luxury car, a target for assumptions. And that, more than anything, made her furious. Amara's car hummed steadily as she drove down the quiet streets, but her thoughts were anything but calm. The world outside seemed to blur as she processed what had just happened. She was still angry, but beneath that anger, there was a deeper feeling of hurt, a feeling that had been buried for so long, a feeling she had tried to ignore, hoping it would fade. It hadn't. She gripped the wheel tighter, her knuckles white against the leather. The flashing lights of the police car behind her, the officer's cold demeanor, the way he had treated her like a criminal. All of it played in her mind like a loop. She had been stopped, not because of anything she had done wrong, but because of who she was. The car, the luxury, the way she didn't fit the stereotype that was expected of her. Her breath caught in her chest as she remembered the officer's words. "Your car. It looks too nice. A car like this, on a street like this." It wasn't just a stop. It was an experience, a moment where she was seen as less than she was, as something suspicious simply because of the exterior. And it wasn't the first time. It was a reminder of all the times in her life when she had been treated differently, when her success had been questioned, when people had assumed she didn't belong. Amara shook her head, trying to shake the thoughts away. She had bigger things to focus on. She had worked too hard for too long to let this kind of injustice affect her. She had earned every bit of success she had. But as she turned down the familiar street toward her home, the anger settled deeper, a heavy, suffocating weight on her chest. Officer Johnson stood by his car, watching Amara's car disappear down the road. His hand lingered on the door, and his mind was clouded with conflicting thoughts. He had been doing this job for years, pulling people over, following protocol, and making decisions based on the rules. He prided himself on being thorough, on keeping his community safe. But something about today didn't sit right with him. He had treated her differently, assumed things about her because of the car she was driving. And that gnawing feeling in his gut wouldn't go away. He had seen enough to know when he was being unfair, when his judgment was clouded by something deeper, something he didn't want to acknowledge. His radio crackled, interrupting his thoughts. "Johnson, everything all right?" came the voice from dispatch. He hesitated before replying, his voice quieter than usual. "Yeah, everything's fine. Just a stop. Nothing to report." He couldn't shake the image of Amara's face, calm yet distant, as she walked to the front of her car. The way she held herself, the silent defiance in her posture. She hadn't resisted, hadn't caused trouble, but he knew he had wronged her. It was the look in her eyes, the look of someone who had seen this before, who had been pushed aside because of something she couldn't control. He had seen that same look in others, people he had pulled over, treated like criminals for no reason at all. He had to make it right. By the time Amara arrived home, her driveway felt like a distant haven, a place where she could breathe, where she could let go of the world for a moment. But the moment she stepped out of her car, her mind was still buzzing with everything that had happened. The walls of her home felt too small, too confining. She needed space. She needed to think. She walked to the back of the house, where the small garden she had tended for years awaited her. Her fingers traced the edges of the flowers as her mind replayed the interaction with the officer, the assumption that had been made about her. She had spent years proving herself, working her way up from nothing, only to be reduced to a stereotype. Amara stood in the garden, breathing in the evening air, letting it wash over her. She knew that her success was something she would always have to fight for, not just professionally, but in the eyes of those around her. It wasn't just about race or about wealth, it was about perception. And she had to fight every day to change that. The weight of it all started to settle in her chest again. The exhaustion, the frustration. But then, something inside her shifted. The anger was still there, but it no longer felt like a weight. Felt like fuel. She had been through too much to let a single moment define her. As she stood in the garden, something shifted. She realized she had been silent for too long. She had let people like Officer Johnson define her, to push her into a corner. But not anymore. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her out of the moment. It was a message from a colleague at the Department of Justice, asking if she was available for a meeting tomorrow. Amara looked at the screen for a moment, her thoughts drifting back to the officer who had judged her based on the car she drove, and then to the work ahead of her. This wasn't just about her. This was bigger. It was about the system, about the world she lived in, about the kind of change that needed to happen. And she was going to be the one to make sure it did. The next day, Amara woke up early, her mind still swirling with the events of the previous evening. As she prepared for her day, the anger and frustration from the traffic stop lingered in her thoughts. She had tried to shake it off, but it wouldn't let go. The injustice, the unfairness, the feeling of being judged by something as superficial as the car she drove. It haunted her. But there was no time to dwell on it. Today was important. She had meetings to attend, cases to review, and a whole department to manage. But as she drove through the city, her thoughts kept drifting back to the encounter with Officer Johnson. The look on his face when he saw the luxury car. The way his assumptions had been so quickly formed. She couldn't let it go. She couldn't let the system win. Her car rolled smoothly through the city streets, the familiar route to the Department of Justice office comforting in its predictability. But something inside her had shifted. She wasn't just going to let this slide. She was going to make sure her voice was heard. She was going to show the world what it meant to truly stand up for justice, to stand up for herself. When Amara pulled into the parking lot, she took a deep breath and parked the car. For a moment, she sat there, the weight of the world pressing on her chest, but she knew what she had to do. She was going to make things right. Not just for herself, but for everyone who had been treated like she had. The courtroom was busy, the usual buzz of lawyers, clients, and judges filling the air as cases were being reviewed. Amara sat at the head of a table in one of the Department of Justice's meeting rooms, reviewing a new case. Her mind was sharp, her focus intense, but she couldn't shake the feeling that today would be different. She received a call that interrupted her thoughts. The name on the screen made her pause. Officer Johnson. Amara answered the call, her voice steady despite the tension she still felt. Hello, Officer Johnson. Ma'am, I wanted to apologize for the incident last night. Officer Johnson's voice crackled through the line. He sounded flustered, hesitant. Not the typical authoritative voice she had heard during their encounter. I know I was out of line, and I've been thinking about it all day. Amara's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't show it. She kept her voice calm, controlled. I appreciate your apology, officer, but you need to understand, this wasn't just about me. It's about the way people like me are treated every single day. There was a long pause before Officer Johnson spoke again. His voice filled with quiet realization. I know, and I'm ashamed of how I acted. It wasn't right. But I want you to know I've been talking to my colleagues and I'm going to bring this up in the department. We need to change how we approach people, especially when we don't know their story. Amara closed her eyes for a moment. She hadn't expected this level of self-awareness, of accountability. But it was a start. She wasn't sure if it was enough, but it was a beginning. You're right, Amara said, her voice firm but not unkind. It's not just about your actions. It's about changing a system that allows these assumptions to persist. It's about making sure everyone is treated with dignity, no matter who they are or what they drive. But you've taken the first step, Officer Johnson. That's all anyone can do. I will. I promise, he said, his voice sincere. And if you ever need anything, I'm here to help. I'll do better. The call ended, and Amara sat back in her chair, feeling the weight of the conversation settle into her bones. For the first time, she felt like maybe, just maybe, there was room for change. Maybe the world wasn't as indifferent as she had thought. As the day drew to a close, Amara found herself sitting in her office, looking out at the city skyline. The light of the setting sun bathed the office in golden hues, but it was the peace she felt that stood out the most. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from winning a case or from the success she had built. It was the peace that came from standing up for what was right. Amara thought back to the events from the previous night, the officer, his assumptions, and her response. She knew that her story wasn't the only one like it. There were countless others who had been judged, overlooked, or treated unfairly simply because of how they appeared. She wasn't the first, and she wouldn't be the last. But she had the power to change things. She had the power to push for real justice, for everyone, regardless of their background or the car they drove. She picked up the phone again, this time dialing a number she knew well. It was time to set the wheels in motion for the next step. It was time to make the system work for everyone. As the evening set in, Amara leaned back in her chair, the dim glow of her desk lamp casting long shadows on the walls. The weight of the day had begun to sink in, but her mind refused to rest. She closed her eyes for a moment, and the familiar sound of city traffic outside seemed to fade. Her thoughts took her back to the years that had led her to this moment, to the struggles that shaped her not just as a professional, but as a person determined to fight for justice. Amara had grown up in a neighborhood where the odds were stacked against her from the start. It wasn't a place where success was expected. It was a place where survival was often the goal. Her childhood was filled with challenges. Her father had left when she was young, and her mother, though strong, worked 2 jobs just to make ends meet. But through it all, her mother had always told her one thing: "You are better than the world will ever let you believe. Don't let anyone make you feel small." Amara had taken those words to heart, but the path forward was never easy. At school, she was often overlooked, treated differently because of the color of her skin. Teachers underestimated her abilities, and classmates judged her before they ever got to know her. She could see the difference in the way she was treated compared to her peers. But instead of letting that stop her, it fueled her desire to prove herself. After graduating from high school, Amara earned a scholarship to a prestigious college, an opportunity that felt like a dream come true. But even in college, the challenges didn't disappear. There were always those who doubted her, those who whispered behind her back, those who assumed she had received the scholarship based on quotas rather than merit. She remembered walking into her first law class, the nervous excitement of being surrounded by students who came from families with power and privilege. She had been raised on hard work, but many of her classmates seemed to have connections that would make their paths easier. She could hear the whispers, feel the looks, but she didn't let it affect her. She was here for a reason, and she wasn't going to let anyone make her feel like she didn't belong. Late nights in the library became her norm. She studied harder than anyone, knowing that she had to be better, smarter, just to prove that she deserved to be there. She felt the weight of being one of the few people of color in her class, and she knew that she had to work twice as hard to get the same recognition. And it paid off. She graduated at the top of her class, landing a prestigious internship at one of the most respected law firms in the country. The firm was known for its elite clientele, its ability to influence politics, and its reputation in the legal world. Amara was about to step into a world that was vastly different from the one she had known, a world where money and power dictated the rules. Years later, as she sat at her desk in the Department of Justice, Amara thought back to those early days, those long nights of studying and fighting to prove her worth. She had built her career from the ground up, determined to make a difference in a system that often overlooked people like her. She had earned her seat at the table, not through connections, but through grit, determination, and the will to never let others define her. It hadn't been easy. There had been moments when she thought about giving up, moments when the weight of it all seemed too much. But each time, her mother's voice echoed in her head, "Don't let anyone make you feel small." And now, here she was, head of a division in the Department of Justice, fighting to bring fairness and accountability to a system that had so often been unjust. One of her most important cases had come when she was appointed as Attorney General. It was a high-profile case involving a corrupt politician who had used his position to exploit vulnerable communities. The system, as it stood, had turned a blind eye to his actions for years, but Amara wasn't about to let him get away with it. The trial was long, full of twists and turns. The opposition lawyers tried every trick in the book to discredit her, to paint her as inexperienced, to make her out to be just another ambitious lawyer with no real power. But Amara fought back with everything she had. The trial ended with a conviction, and the corrupt politician was sentenced to prison. It was a victory not just for her, but for the communities that had been silenced for so long. It was in that moment, after the trial had concluded, when Amara truly understood the power she held. It wasn't about the title or the recognition. It was about the ability to change lives, to make the world a better place for those who had been overlooked. It was about justice. As Amara sat in her office, reflecting on her journey, she felt the familiar fire burning within her. The officer's assumptions from last night were just a small part of the bigger picture, but they had reignited something deep inside her. A determination to keep fighting, to keep proving that people like her could make a difference. She reached for her phone, scrolling through messages and emails, but there was something different in the way she approached her work now. The fight wasn't just about legal victories. It was about changing perceptions, challenging biases, and making sure that everyone, regardless of their background, had an equal chance to succeed. She wasn't just a lawyer. She wasn't just a figure in the Department of Justice. She was someone who had spent her life breaking down barriers. And now, she was ready to take on the world. Amara sat back in her office chair, looking out at the sprawling city skyline before her. The lights of the city twinkled in the distance, but her thoughts were far from the beauty of the view. They were still tangled in the events of the previous evening. The police stop, the assumptions, and the officer's apology. That moment had set something inside her into motion, a shift in the way she saw the world and her role in it. Despite the victory of the case she had won earlier that day, there was still a weight pressing down on her chest. It wasn't the usual burden of the work she did. No, this was something more personal. It was the realization that even with all the success she had earned, the respect she had fought for, there would always be those who judged her by the color of her skin, by her appearance, by her choices. And, despite her position and her achievements, she couldn't escape that. Her phone buzzed on the desk, snapping her back to the present. It was a message from her assistant, asking if she was ready for her next meeting. She sighed, then replied with a brief yes, "I'll be there in 10. Before leaving, Amara glanced over at the stack of case files on her desk, the legal briefs and evidence that demanded her attention. They had waited for her to give them time, but today her mind was elsewhere. She had to reconcile what had happened, what she had experienced. Amara thought back to the times she had fought against the very biases and prejudices that had now touched her life personally. She remembered being a young lawyer, fresh out of law school, filled with optimism and determination. Back then, she had walked into a courtroom and immediately felt the weight of the assumptions about her background, her race, and her gender. It had been a constant battle to prove that she belonged there. But it wasn't just the courtroom where this battle had raged. It was everywhere, on the streets, in meetings with colleagues, in conversations with clients. There was always a line she had to walk, a tightrope between being seen as competent and being judged for being different. She had learned to navigate it, but the reality of it was that she had to work twice as hard to earn the respect others were handed without question. That same feeling returned as she sat in her office, processing the police stop. She realized that no matter how high she rose, no matter how much she achieved, she would always be forced to navigate a world that saw her first as other. It wasn't fair, but it was her reality. But the question in her mind, the one that gnawed at her, was how to respond. How to keep going, keep fighting without losing herself in the process. Amara walked out of her office, the sound of her heels clicking in the hallway, each step a reminder of the journey she had undertaken to get here. She reached the elevator and stepped inside, pressing the button for the top floor where the meeting would take place. As the elevator doors slid shut, she took a deep breath. She wasn't angry anymore. Not at the officer, not at the system. She had made her point, and that was enough. But she wasn't about to stop fighting either. Her fight had always been about more than just proving others wrong. It was about changing the system, about ensuring that the next generation wouldn't have to face the same struggles she had faced. The elevator dinged as it reached the top floor, and Amara stepped out with a renewed sense of purpose. The day ahead was full of meetings, but today, she would approach them differently. Today, she would stand in her truth, not just as a woman, not just as a lawyer, but as someone who was determined to make sure that the world saw her for who she truly was. The meeting room was quiet as Amara stepped inside. The other attorneys and department heads were already gathered, papers in hand, their conversations ceasing as she entered. She nodded politely to each one, taking her seat at the head of the table. As the meeting started, the usual cases and legal discussions filled the air, but Amara couldn't focus entirely on them. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the incident with Officer Johnson. For the first time in a long time, she felt like the system that she had spent years defending was failing her, failing people like her. She thought about her mother, who had always told her to rise above the injustices, but also to never let them slide. Her mother had worked harder than anyone Amara knew, only to be judged and dismissed for things she couldn't control. Amara's hands gripped the edge of the table as she found herself, once again, at the intersection of law and life. The injustice she had faced was not just about being pulled over by the police. It was about the systemic issues that lay beneath the surface, the assumptions that were made before anyone got to know the truth. When Amara had first started working at the Department of Justice, she had been idealistic. She thought that if she worked hard enough, the system would recognize her abilities and her contributions. And for the most part, it did. But there were always moments that reminded her of the gap between the system and the people it was supposed to protect. One of the earliest cases she worked on had involved a family who had been wronged by a corporation that had polluted their water supply. It was a tough fight, but Amara had given everything she had to make sure the family received justice. It had taken years of hard work and sacrifices, but eventually, the company was forced to clean up the mess it had made. The case had been a personal victory for her, but it was also a bitter reminder of how difficult it was to hold the powerful accountable. Now, years later, as she sat at the table, Amara realized something had changed in her. The fight wasn't just about winning cases anymore. It was about ensuring that people like her, people who had been overlooked and treated unfairly, had a place in the world that acknowledged their worth. As the meeting progressed, Amara couldn't help but notice the shift in her perspective. She didn't need to prove herself to anyone anymore. She didn't need to fight for recognition or acceptance. Her value had already been defined by her actions, by the work she had done, and by the fight she had been willing to take on. The other members of the meeting seemed unaware of the internal transformation Amara was experiencing. But she knew it was time. Time to take the lessons she had learned and make them part of something bigger. The cases they discussed today were important, but they were only part of the story. The real story was the one that needed to be told outside these walls. The story of justice for everyone, no matter their race, their background, or their wealth. Amara's thoughts returned to Officer Johnson, and she couldn't help but think about how far he had come. It was a small step, but it was a step in the right direction. She knew that changing the world would take time, but it was moments like these, when someone was willing to reflect on their actions, when they were willing to listen, that made the fight worth it. She didn't need to fight for herself anymore. She needed to fight for the next generation, for everyone who had been told they didn't belong, for everyone who had been judged without being seen. Amara stood up from the table, the meeting drawing to a close. She looked around the room at her colleagues, some of them who had been with her since the beginning, some who had just joined the department, but they all shared the same goal: justice. It was a goal that was never truly completed, but always worked toward. She smiled to herself, knowing that her journey was far from over. The road ahead would be long and full of challenges, but it would be worth it. She wasn't just going to fight the system. She was going to change it, piece by piece. As Amara walked out of the meeting room, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. She was exactly where she was meant to be. She had earned her place in this world, and no one, no matter how hard they tried, would ever make her feel small again. The world may judge you based on how you look, where you come from, or what you have. But in the end, your worth is determined by your actions, by your heart, and by your willingness to stand up for what is right. As the camera zooms out, Amara walks through the hallway, her figure slowly fading into the distance. The city outside continues to buzz, the lights shining as bright as ever. But for Amara, it feels like a new chapter has begun. She has found her voice, and with it, she will change the world. True worth isn't defined by appearances or material possessions. It's shaped by our actions, our integrity, and our ability to stand up for justice, no matter the cost. Society often judges us based on what they see on the outside, but it's the strength within, the compassion we show, and the way we challenge injustice that defines who we truly are. Don't let the world decide your value. Only you have the power to shape your own story. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Karma Stories for more real-life dramas with powerful twists and profound lessons. Let's change the way we see the world, one story at a time.